When I was a child, I used to imagine that I was a video game character. This was not a logical, conscious choice, rather, it just seemed like the right direction to take my abstract understanding of the world. It made sense aesthetically. My body was nothing but an avatar, and even my movements were dictated by the analog controller that rested in my mind. Often I would even imagine my spatial awareness to be that of a third person, partially top-down perspective, like you would commonly see in an RPG or many other video games. Every motion was calculated, and even my place in society was cast as a story, with moving parts that weren't necessarily predetermined, but still aligned with a logical, streamlined structure. As if every place I could go was specifically aware that I would someday go there. I was impressed and still am that they were able to pre-render those areas of the level, although I suppose I can't be sure if they actually did. I felt like a mile of ice cream, and every space around me was occupied by my consciousness at certain points in time. My perception of reality admittedly didn't even make for a very fun video game. Sometimes it took the form of a direct-to-television VHS sequel to a Charlotte's Web. There are about 10 of those my mind created to recontextualize my life. More on that later. The fact that I'm even able to use that bizarre line as a reference in this video means that I relate quite closely to the indie horror visual novel Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk. The fact that that name also makes complete and utter sense to me only serves to reinforce that fact. Today, this is the game we will be taking a closer look at, a visual novel that I consider to be an incredible work of narrative fiction. But let's slow down, because I imagine that most people haven't played or maybe even heard of this indie gem, and I'm going to change that. The story of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk is beautifully simple. You follow a girl, helping her along as she goes to the store to purchase some lovely calcium, and then return home. That's literally the entire game. And being a visual novel, all you really do is read, mostly her thoughts, and then pretty frequently pick dialogue options. This can be completed in 15 minutes, making for an extremely short and seemingly mundane experience. Why would anyone want to play this game? Doesn't it just sound extremely boring? And that's kind of the point. The task itself is mundane. It is extremely basic. And yet if you've experienced the story yourself, you know just how much the girl struggles with it. With her unspecified condition, such a simple thing is made incredibly difficult, involving so many different twists and turns, mental gymnastics that are almost crippling. The trip to the store may as well be an odyssey, with this lucrative bag of milk as her prize. The way in which the narrative is able to portray just how difficult this girl's life has become through a simple task is honestly pretty genius. But that wouldn't mean much if the game itself was engaging or interesting. But, well, I wouldn't be making this video if it weren't. The actual draw of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk isn't really the journey of going to the store, but rather the girl's thoughts as she makes the trip. The conversation you have with her is both endlessly interesting and, at least in my case, eerily relatable. And it's the fact that you have a conversation with her in the first place that adds an element of mystery and allure. Who are you playing as? What are you playing as? That question remains unclear, and while I'll be trying to answer that in this video, I have no definite answers. Needless to say, there are a lot of different aspects of these conversations that I will be breaking down, and that is what we'll be spending the majority of this video doing, as I try and uncover what exactly is going on within this bizarre mind, and apply my own experiences to this story to attempt to recontextualize everything and make sense of it all. But let me first tell you the story in its basic form. If you don't want any spoilers at all, leave now. The game begins with you naming yourself, and then joining the girl as she walks to the store to buy a bag of milk. It's immediately obvious that something is a bit off about her, as she hyper-focuses on seemingly mundane details to the point of making her almost unable to reach the store. She even proclaims herself to be the protagonist of a visual novel, as she talks with you, the player. You can choose to either encourage her along or make her feel terrible about herself. The game will eventually bring you to the store where she faces similar difficulties, but is now confronted with people. Well, you can assume they're people, but they don't exactly look like it. You even get treated with a new phobia to take home, the letter O. Eventually, with some help from you, she is able to finally purchase the milk and begins her journey back home, pondering her condition, circumstances, verbal structures, life, death, ice cream, and everything in between. You two sit on a bench together looking up at the sky, and she reveals some of her secrets but raises even more questions. Once home, she opens the door, is met with her lovely and beautiful mother, may I say, and goes to her room. And that's it. That's the entire game, and I could not recommend it enough. It's literally not even $1 on Steam, so go play it. The story itself may be mundane, but it's the dialogue, some of the most interesting in gaming that we're gonna dive into. And if you're looking for a Let's Play the visual novel instead, hey, would you look at that? I just so happened to do one on my second channel, link in the description of course, where I try to unearth this narrative in real time. The choice is yours, or maybe the choice was never yours to begin with. But either way, there will be full spoilers ahead. So, let's get into it. The human brain is not designed to realize that it's slowly breaking down. Even if this deterioration is only present on a chemical level, such as an imbalance, it's difficult for the mind to conceive that it's just not working properly. This can be damaging to anyone, literally not being able to fully contextualize your own mental illness. But the effects are especially devastating for those with a perception or personality disorder, and in more extreme cases, some kind of psychosis. Depersonalization is when you cannot relate yourself to your own body. Your entire sense of self can become extremely distorted. And while it's difficult to accurately portray this feeling with words, people experiencing this phenomenon would often describe it as feeling like a robot, or like an avatar. 2 minutes into Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk clearly reveals that the protagonist heavily suffers from this, as she imagines herself to be the protagonist of a visual novel, which, well, I guess she technically is, which only makes the game's metastructure that much more fascinating. This is a feeling that I can personally relate to a lot, as I described in the cold opening of this video. I have always imagined myself as a video game character since a young age. Sometimes on an especially adventurous day, I would catalog my adventures as being spin-off direct-to-TV sequels to A Charlotte's Web. I would often fantasize about what the commercial would be like with the voiceover and the trailer for the film, and imagine myself popping in the tape into the VHS player and watching it. I think there are about 14 different sequels or something like that. And to this day, I have no idea why my 7-year-old brain decided that Charlotte's Web was the right film to base my vivid perception around. I hardly even remember the movie itself. There are many reasons why someone may have an episode or several of depersonalization. The cause can even be a combination of multiple. When you don't particularly like yourself or the current state your life is in, it can serve as a comfy sense of detachment from your circumstances. These bad things aren't happening to you, but rather to your avatar. It gives you a shield in a sense. And most people will probably feel this way at some point in their lives, but only on very rare occasions. Others, like the game's protagonist, clearly have a more deep-rooted issue that is particularly engraved into her own self-perceptions, to the point where feeling normal is probably more rare than the alternative. Strangely enough, I actually rarely see myself as a video game character anymore. Rather, I have what I call narrative delusions, where I contextualize significant life events, or hopefully future events, as arcs in an anime, filled with passionate outbursts that I don't really have in real life, and sometimes even superpowers. I don't usually see my body specifically as an avatar. This isn't to say that I still don't suffer from depersonalization, however, but it's just that it doesn't really materialize in the same way. I honestly would probably say it has gotten worse to the point where it is an immense struggle to even look at myself in the mirror. I wouldn't always say that this is due to feeling out of body, although that certainly plays a big part, but rather I feel like being a human is just kind of weird. It certainly doesn't help that I already find the nature of consciousness and the mind to be up to some major contention, but this feeling is more aesthetic than even just those mental mind games. It simply feels wrong. And one thing I love about Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk is that it seemingly understands what I mean when I say that. You can't really explain a line like the one used in the game, "I feel like a mile of ice cream." It doesn't necessarily make sense, but there are those like myself that will instantly understand what it means. Similarly, I don't really expect many people to understand what I mean when I use the word aesthetically all the time, and I can't really explain what I mean by it either, although I did make a video on it, link in the description of course. It's just a feeling, one that is derived from not even just a warped perception of reality, but just a different one from the norm. I think that's why art is dominated by the neurodivergent, the so-called outliers of society. We have feelings that just cannot be explained through conventional means, and must instead align our explanations in the same way that the feelings are manifested within ourselves, abstractly. A painting is not just a paragraph of words, not for any logical reasoning, but rather that the painter could not express what they were trying to with words alone, or even at all. Instead, they rely on the aesthetic sixth sense, trying to appeal to the part of the human mind that interprets the uncommon, the art of the world. Of course, no one person is going to look at a piece of art and see the same thing, so the entire ordeal just sort of melds into individuals' perceptions based around an abstract concept. All the artist is really trying to do is impact the collective consciousness that has impacted them, as everyone already tries to do, but just may lack the specific qualities that make doing so easier within the current landscape that society has constructed. And the more abstract and conventionally incomprehensible the feeling is, the more abstract and often obscure the art becomes. This game is a great example of that. It understands when I say that something just feels wrong when I look in the mirror or at other people, just as I understand that when it says the character feels like a mile of ice cream, that feeling is too abstract to really give an explanation to, yet I can somehow fully comprehend what is being said. But screw that. This is a YouTube video. You want an explanation better than that, so I'll give it a shot. I would say that this feeling aligns with a few things, all of which we'll be discussing in this video soon enough. High spatial awareness, of which may possibly spawn from OCD, depersonalization as we already briefly discussed, derealization, and similarly, a distorted perception of the structure of reality. To go in order, let's start with the first one. The girl displays various symptoms of OCD throughout the entire game, mostly in the way that she constantly keeps track of and counts her every movement. There is an earlier section where she hyperfixates on the amount of times she has stepped with each foot, and the presumable voice inside of her head points out that she has stepped on asphalt 50 times, but the grass 51 times. This simply cannot be allowed. In the ensuing panic and mental gymnastics to correct this seemingly meaningless mistake, along with her hyper-awareness of the differentiation of walking back another step being the 52nd step or reversing back to the 50th, is probably the most relatable thing ever presented to me within a video game. Now, I don't hear actual voice inside of my head as like an auditory hallucination, but it's also not entirely clear if the girl does either. For me, it feels more like a battle against myself and my own obsessions, the latter serving as the voice that tells you that what you're doing is all wrong. It's basically like talking to yourself unintentionally, which is obviously quite different from actual hallucinations. We will be discussing this more in a bit, however. This hyper-awareness, of which I will not say is definitively OCD, but has similar elements, is portrayed clearly through her mile of ice cream. She explains that during this walk, her body will be in every part of this way. My interpretation of this is a direct correlation of my own experiences and my hyper-awareness of spatial structures. I imagine that while she is walking, she can literally feel every molecule, every minute detail that is involved in that stroll. And paired with her already clear depersonalization, it would make sense that she may feel her very body being stretched to all encompass this enhanced spatial awareness, identifying herself more at the vibrations of the air around her and the experience of walking through this hyper-vivid area of town than with her own sack of meat she calls a body. She essentially states as much when she says my body would be in every part of this way. But why ice cream? You can say this is also due to her hyper-awareness, her obsessions calculating her own spatial presence to be inflicted with the milk she's carrying, as evidenced by her pointing out the exact ratios of water to milk in this conglomerate of ice cream. This would also surely align with the out-of-body factor, as she counts the milk she's carrying as being part of her new, more ethereal body. but I don't really think that's the extent of it, as she describes the walk from the store to the gas station she is currently at to be a stick, while the way home is ice cream. This to me screams derealization, as she almost imagines the environment around her to bend to her will, a point which she further makes a bit later on, as she pretty literally describes her environment and everything within it morphing around her, following her mind specifically. Ironically enough, I wouldn't call this main character syndrome, even though she does imagine herself to be a main character, but rather she simply cannot comprehend, whether entirely or in episodes, the environment around her. It is entirely distorted, and it would seem that only the bizarre can contextualize the world around her. Thus, she almost has to imagine the walk to her house being something like ice cream, especially when you further pair this with both her spatial hyper-awareness previously discussed, and her self-identification with the space she is taking up, of which includes the key component of ice cream, liquefied dairy. God, that is a fun word to say. Essentially, she now at least partially identifies as a cold, creamy conglomerate, and since she determines that the reality surrounding her path is molded around her very consciousness, then that path itself would then be ice cream. I'm not sure if it's actually a mile, but that would then stretch her being out to be, and say it with me now, a mile of ice cream. Simple maths. We'll be discussing derealization specifically more in depth in just a little bit, but I hope I have made clear how her own lack of solidified structure within her perception of herself and the environment around her, as well as her brain that is just hardwired to both think very abstractly and hyper-focus on details, has led to her describing herself as a mile of ice cream. I'm just now realizing that I've spent 4 long paragraphs, probably around 5 minutes or so, explaining something I just said couldn't be explained, but that's just the way life goes. I still don't think this is a feeling that you could fully break down in words, but my job as a video essayist is to both point out that fact, but also try to recontextualize it into words anyway, for a wider audience to better understand. I don't believe this is a line, or even a game, that most would easily comprehend, and may even be damn near impossible to do so without personal experience of at least some of these things. If you have said experience, I wouldn't be shocked if you, like myself, instantly knew what the girl meant when she said she felt like a mile of ice cream, even if you couldn't really explain why until some further thinking. The world around her, especially the people within it, are grossly distorted, to the point of being unrecognizable. I mean, this reminds me of Song of Saya, and if you know, well, may God have mercy on your soul. The entire world is painted in a sort of dirty, almost rusty red hue, which is clearly spawned from her father's death, as she explains. And while that certainly points to her condition being at the very least severely worsened right after these circumstances, and dominating her supposed delusions, that's not actually the most interesting part to me. Art is abstract. That's what I love about it. The events of Hereditary didn't actually happen as displayed on screen, but rather as a reimagining, an abstract interpretation of a family falling apart. And while I believe Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk to be a bit more straightforward than that, what I love about it is it's never clear exactly what's going on. Sure, you can assume she has something like schizophrenia or OCD, but the game goes out of its way to deny any answer to that question. A move in which not only makes the entire situation much more ambiguous, but makes it much more widely relatable. We need to respect her wishes here and not make any firm diagnosis. We owe her that much, at least. I eerily related to the world of the game. My perception of the environment is quite skewed, to the point where reality just seems kind of bizarre. And if I had suffered from something as horrific as the passing of my own father in such a way, I could imagine my perception being just as distorted as the girl. Of course, she could literally see everything in red, but, well, that's usually not how it works. Visual hallucinations, especially to such a drastic degree, are extremely rare to begin with. For her eyeballs to actually see the world in that way, it's just not very likely. Possible, of course, and I will never say for certain what she does have, but I want to look at it from another angle, one that I can properly talk about and relate to. Don't take this as anything but my personal perspective on things. My interpretation of this red hue is that while she can literally see the world around her clearly, she cannot comprehend or contextualize it. To her, the space may as well be a distant planet, as the things around her simply don't make sense. Her abstract perception, that of which takes every little step into account, has become so inherently tied to her fractured psyche that she relates her very reality itself around her life's most traumatic moment, her father's death. So while she may not actually see the world in red, the game is using abstraction to show us her warped perception and putting us into her shoes, her bizarre world. We can also pretty safely assume that her very condition, whatever it may be, is hereditary, and is probably the reason her father took his own life, as evidenced by the various parallels made between him and his daughter, of which we clearly see her thoughts when these comparisons are made. She's suicidal. Even so, while this is probably a genetic condition, I imagine that her symptoms weren't too bad until her father's death, when the stress, confusion, and sadness made them explode out to the forefront. This is extremely common in mentally ill patients, having trauma not exactly be the start of a condition, but the thing that exacerbated it. It's also entirely possible that his death could have been the start of it all, but, well, it hardly really matters within the context of this game. The point is that she's suffering. This even further applies to the people around her. And since I'm bored of conventional analysis, it's time to get you in the proper mindset. I want you to imagine this scenario. You're at the park and have been playing football nonstop for almost 2 hours now. You're beyond exhausted, but also exhilarated at the same time. It's hard to remember when you've had this much fun. The people you're playing with are some of your best friends. You've known them for countless years now. You're talking about nothing, laughing about everything. You're happy. But then, as you look at your friend's face, something you've normally done so many times, something is different. Something is wrong. That's not your friend. Did he always look like that? No, but he looks the same. He doesn't look any different than he did just a few moments ago. Then why? Why? What happened? And as you continue to question this, your friend becomes even more unknown to you. You've never seen this person in your entire life. They frighten you. You're scared, terrified. Your eyes are fine, but your mind, it starts to unravel their face, every single detail becoming foreign to you now. It disgusts you. Your friend disgusts you. You begin to question what a person even is, what a human even is. Are they human? Am I human? Your mind doesn't understand. How could it? They no longer appear before you as a person, but rather as some sort of alien, a monster. You're the only person left in the world, and you have no idea why. Your friend, someone you've known for years, you suddenly don't know them anymore. We naturally associate people we know with a certain environment or sense or object. I had a piece of celery today and instantly thought of my grandmother, as when we were younger and slept at her house, she would always have a veggie platter at the ready. One of my favorite things on said platter was, as you can probably guess, the celery. I'm sure you've eaten some cooking and immediately thought of a relative making something very similar. Even with something like anime, the first thing I think of and what I'll probably remember on my deathbed is the chilly snow blowing into my dorm room every time my roommate opened the door as I watched Steins Gate. Those are fond memories, and I like to sleep in the cold, so the window was always open. To some degree, we understand people and things through different contexts, but this can be taken too far. If you experience something like derealization as something akin to what the girl faces, then people can start to almost become those contexts. Let's say you have a friend, and with this friend you love to go to Olive Garden, but you also hang out with this friend at your house. Normally you would associate your friend with both elements of Olive Garden and elements of your house. For example, when you eat fettuccine alfredo, you might think of them. You may also be happening to play Guitar Hero 5 Warriors of Rock, something you do with them at your house a lot, and the connection is further made. Putting aside the seemingly impossible task of playing Guitar Hero while simultaneously eating pasta, this association is what people normally do. Both of these things make you think of your friend, who in your mind is one solidified person. It's your friend. Things are not always so easy, however. If you lose enough of your grasp on reality for whatever reason, it can become extremely difficult to parse through such associations. You may already find it difficult enough to fully contextualize who your friend even is, which only has a certain number of solutions. It is my theory that in times like these, your brain must associate your friend even more so than normal with an object, environment, or sense. And since it can't really understand anymore what something as complex and abstract as a person is, then it needs to simplify the equation and more or less say that your friend is a bowl of pasta, or perhaps even a mile of ice cream. Of course, this is a terrible way of thinking. Most likely your friend is not a bowl of nutritionally deficient carbohydrates. They would probably even get offended if you told them that they were. But even more so, since you have at least 2 associations with them in this example, then your friend can't just be pasta. They must also be Guitar Hero. And since you lack the ability to give them one singular identity, they really kind of become 2 separate people, each being understood within their own separate contexts. You once had a friend. Now you have a bowl of pasta and, admittedly, one of the greatest games ever made. 2 friends. Congratulations. One could assume that this feeling would only serve to further fuel the delusions. It's a perpetual cycle. Logically, you're aware that, yeah, of course they're just one person, but your brain will, for whatever reason, not let your mind fully realize that. As if your body itself is telling you that's wrong, even though you know it's right. And that is a lonely feeling, and one that does nothing but serve to further make reality seem just a bit bizarre. It's as if you're not really looking at people anymore. Everything has melded together. Context becomes king. When I saw the alien-like beings within the game, I instantly interpreted them through this framework. It's not that the girl actually sees them like that, but rather that's how she has come to perceive them, to understand them. And that feeling is beyond scary. It's honestly horrifying. Feeling as if not even just reality is an illusion, but that even the people you love the most, your support systems, can turn into monsters at the blink of an eye. Even the girl's mother appears before her as some kind of demon. This is the horror that makes a simple walk to and from the store so fascinating, so horrifying, and so crushing. To question if this feeling will ever go away. To question if it will get worse. If one day you'll completely lose all grasp on reality. Question that if that happens, can you even be said to be alive? To know these things, to question these things, to see strangers and loved ones turn into aliens at the drop of a hat, and have to smile through it all, acting as if nothing has happened. It's scary. It's one of the most horrible feelings in the world. This phenomenon is broadly known as derealization, and when paired with depersonalization like we previously discussed, leads to an experience like shown in the game. The actual causes of such a condition vary greatly and are linked to many different mental illnesses and trauma. Derealization can also fluctuate a lot in severity and frequency. It's not even really a condition, as almost everybody suffers from it at some point in their life. But when it's persistent and severe, then it is most likely derived from something much more concerning. In the case of milk inside a bag of milk inside a bag of milk, it sadly falls into the latter. I imagine that the girl can't even look at people anymore. Can't even look at herself in the mirror anymore. She might not even recognize anything or anyone. We've been breaking this game down this far in a very non-linear way, but now I want to specifically look at the last few minutes, right after the girl pretty hilariously decides to sit at the cliche bench and speak to the player of the visual novel. This can be taken many different ways, and the main question becomes, who are we playing as? When we name ourselves in the beginning of the game, that is clearly supposed to be the name of the new medication that the girl is taking. And while reading, I naturally assumed that all of the dialogue options were intrusive thoughts, perhaps even auditory hallucinations that were affected by the pills. If we go down the nice route, then the medication is shown to be working, and it helps the girl along. But if we choose the meaner options, the game will pretty quickly end, and the girl exclaims that these pills aren't helping. In this way, we are essentially playing as her medication, and a lot of the game's horror comes from the fact that we see such an array of different options. We can then presume that there is an almost limitless amount of different thoughts or voices that can enter her mind, and we see just how many of them can hurt her, make her hate herself, or even worse, That's simply horrifying, especially since she knows that her mind holds that negative potential at all times. But the end of the game makes me question this notion. It makes it seem like there are actually three characters: the girl, the pills, and you. She even takes you to the bench, away from most of the dialogue options, explicitly calling you the reader, and even distinguishing your presence from the medication, saying that you were the reason her trip was actually a success. She doesn't even talk anymore, as evidenced by the lack of sound effects, and just thinks what she's saying to you. Hell, she even takes away the text box. Little editor's note here: I'm pretty sure that when you're talking with her in this discussion, you type out all of your answers, and there's really no dialogue options like before. I think I was confused of why this was like a thing, and I'm pretty sure this was to make the distinction once again between the pills or whatever and then you. So, yeah. So what does this mean? As I said, this can be taken in a lot of different ways, and I would love to hear some more interpretations in the comments, but here's what I think. She explicitly states that she knows that you're really just something she made up inside of her head, and I think this fits within the framework of the visual novel format. In my favorite line in the game, she said that she chose to be a visual novel character today, meaning this is probably the first time, and it was a deliberate choice. This is where an important distinction must be made. She doesn't state herself to be a video game character as what I've experienced, but rather a visual novel character specifically. This is vital to understanding what's going on here, I think. Novel is in the title after all, so you could say that perhaps the most important part of the visual novel is that someone is there to read it. If no one is, it's really just a regular video game. So you are what makes it a visual novel. Yet that doesn't really explain what you are. I surely don't think this is a metagame like Doki Doki Literature Club. No, what seems much more likely to me is that you are the girl. Like a true visual novel, she is the self-insert character. Let me explain. The mind is an interesting phenomenon. I've discussed it so much in my videos this far, and yet I've barely scratched the surface on how I believe it actually works. That will warrant probably an entire book at some point, but that time isn't now. What I can say though is that our sense of self-awareness can almost manifest into a sort of second voice inside of our head. Not an actual voice, of course, but something a bit more abstract. I want you to think, right now. As I say this, you're probably questioning, what does he mean? Why does he want me to think? I've been thinking this whole time, what more can I do here? Those thoughts, you didn't hear them, but you also kind of did, right? They appeared in your head, and while it's difficult to say exactly how that happened, it does happen to all of us. These are materialized words, as if you heard a noise but without your ear ever picking up on them. In a way, it just cuts out the middleman. I would consider this voice to be part of your self-consciousness. You're reflecting on things around you, and more importantly, you're constantly reflecting on yourself. This reflection materializes in the form of thoughts. Even though the entire process of thinking itself is a lot more whole, it's incredibly hard to distinguish the individual parts. But what happens if your psyche is fractured? How do you contextualize all of this? This appears to be happening to our protagonist. When she sits on the bench, she is really just speaking to herself. It's as if two different people are within her mind. Her reactionary initial thoughts and then the reflection of said thoughts. We, the player, serve as a second, recontextualized as a reader of a visual novel by the girl herself, perhaps in an attempt to disassociate from the situation, or even more likely to personify her self-awareness, so that she can stick to her task. She even says that we are the reason she is able to buy milk, as she didn't want to screw up in front of us. Personifying that part of your mind could probably accomplish that task. Of course, this isn't a one-to-one comparison, as the two separate beings are a bit too distinct to comfortably fall into this explanation. She could have some sort of personality disorder that is being affected by the drugs to tell her different things, but I'm honestly not sure. What's important here, though, is that she is alone on that bench. She is talking to herself. The sad truth about mental illness is that it's internal. Many external reasons can cause it, of course, but the results are all part of your mind. Intrusive thoughts and imagery, anxiety, depression, even psychosis, it all ultimately comes from the inside, which is why it can be so scary. The one thing we inherently can never escape from is our own mind. It's not even just a part of you. it is you. Perhaps this realization is part of the reason the girl decided to be in a visual novel, so she could separate the thought she had little control over into a different entity. It may still be inside of her, but at least she could say it wasn't her. In short, we are the girl. We always were. We are her sense of self-awareness. The game gives us the illusion of choice, but it's all a facade. Not only are we given just a few options to choose from, all of which the nice ones only derive from the medication we took, but the final choice is not a choice at all. Just as she gets a break, just as she is happy for 5 seconds, just as she is finally proud of herself and enjoyed a day, and just as she is finally about to open up and say all the things she's wanted to say for so long. It's time to go home. We understand. And as we pass by the staircase, we are overcome with her situation. We enjoy blissful silence, but it never lasts. The world is unpleasant. Life is unpleasant. We are home. We have brought home the milk. The milk inside a bag of milk inside a bag of milk. Thus, we've come to the end of our game. A 15-minute experience that I've probably spent twice that amount of time talking about. A tale about going to the store and buying milk. A tale that I can only describe as an odyssey. But of course, this is not the end of the tale. What would happen if we went outside a bag of milk? Perhaps even a bag of milk outside of bag of milk outside of bag of milk. That's right, folks. This game has a sequel. A much more well-known sequel, actually, by the looks of it. Admittedly, I only really played this game so I could play the much more interesting-looking sequel. Little did I know this visual novel would become the piece of media I probably relate to the most. I originally planned on covering both games in one video, but I can't do that. Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk deserves its own video, its own time in the spotlight, and I will give it such. I haven't even played the second game as of the time of writing and recording, as I don't want any of my thoughts to be altered by a separate experience. This tale of the purchase of Daria, this is the tale I want to cover. We'll save the sequel until next time. But before I go, I want to make one thing clear. None of us are alone. As crippling as mental illness can be, as isolating and lonely as an experience it can be, there are ways to help. Even if the hell is so inherently tied to our minds, even if every day seems horrifying, it's still a life worth living. You're not alone, and help is always within reach. If any of my viewers have experienced or are experiencing anything similar to what this game portrays or any sort of mental illness, please seek help. It can go a long way. With that, I shall take my bag of milk and go. A bag of milk that was within another bag of milk. A milk inside a bag of milk that hid yet another bag of milk. Milk inside a bag of milk inside a bag of milk. Until next time. And, as always, thank you for watching.